Afghanistan, 1985. The Soviet army had been fighting there for years. Across the border in Pakistan, thousands of foreign volunteers, weapons, intelligence officers, and Islamic fighters were gathering for a war that had become one of the biggest proxy conflicts of the Cold War. And among them was someone almost nobody expected to see, a Japanese martial artist. His name was Koshiro Tanaka. Somehow, a Japanese office worker from Tokyo ended up joining the Afghan Mujahideen and fighting Soviet forces. So the obvious question is, why? To understand how Tanaka ended up in Afghanistan, we have to go back to Japan. Tanaka was born in 1940 in Fukuoka Prefecture. Unlike the image you might expect of a foreign fighter, he wasn't raised as some professional soldier. He became a businessman. But martial arts were a major part of his life. He studied karate, as well as other Japanese martial arts, and eventually became a highly ranked karate practitioner. By the 1980s, however, Tanaka had become increasingly interested in something much bigger than martial arts. War, more specifically, the Soviet Union. There was a historical reason for Tanaka's hostility toward Moscow. At the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union took control of the Kuril Islands. The territorial dispute remained deeply controversial in Japan, and Tanaka viewed the Soviet Union through that personal Japanese lens. When Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan in 1979, he saw something more than a distant conflict. To him, the Soviet Union was once again expanding its power, and eventually Tanaka decided that simply watching wasn't enough. Contemporary reporting described his motivation in remarkably simple terms. He believed the Soviet Union wanted territory, and he wanted to oppose it. But there was one enormous problem. He had never actually fought in a war. In 1985, Tanaka left his life in Tokyo behind. He traveled to Peshawar, Pakistan. At the time, Peshawar was one of the major centers of the Afghan resistance. Thousands upon thousands of Afghan refugees were living in and around the city, while resistance networks used the region as a gateway into Afghanistan. And Tanaka didn't arrive empty-handed. Accounts say he brought roughly $10,000 to help the Afghan resistance, but he wanted to do more than donate money. He wanted to participate. He eventually became associated with Jamiat-e-Islami, the Afghan resistance organization led by Burhanuddin Rabbani, and then something almost surreal happened. The Japanese businessman who had arrived wearing a Western-style suit changed into Afghan clothing. The suit was gone. The shalwar kameez was on. Imagine you're walking through the streets of Peshawar in the 80s. The city is crowded with Afghan refugees. Weapons are moving across the border. The Soviet Union is fighting a brutal war in Afghanistan. And then, among all these Afghan fighters, Pakistanis, Arabs, and foreigners, there's a Japanese man wearing a shalwar kameez. Tanaka was heading toward a war thousands of kilometers from Japan, but having a black belt didn't magically turn Tanaka into a soldier. He had martial arts experience. He did not have battlefield experience, and he learned the difference very quickly. In 1987, Tanaka described his first combat experience to the Christian Science Monitor. He had accompanied Mujahideen during a raid near Jagdalak, east of Kabul. Then the shooting started. Tanaka later recalled that he didn't initially know how to move or fight in an actual battlefield, and then a bullet passed close to him. That was his introduction to war. Not a martial arts tournament, not training, not theory, a real bullet. But Tanaka did have something the fighters around him didn't necessarily possess: his martial arts expertise. He began teaching Afghan fighters hand-to-hand combat, and this is where his story becomes particularly strange. A Japanese martial artist had traveled halfway around the world to teach Afghan guerrillas how to fight. He wasn't simply passing through, he became involved in the conflict. Contemporary reporting described Tanaka as a 6th-degree karate black belt who was teaching Afghan fighters, and he kept returning. According to later accounts, he made multiple journeys to Afghanistan during the conflict. This wasn't a one-time adventure. He was becoming increasingly committed to the Afghan cause. But while Tanaka was becoming known among Afghan fighters, back in Japan, his story was being viewed very differently. The Japanese government did not approve of what he was doing, and honestly, it's not difficult to understand why. Japan was a deeply pacifist society. Here was a Japanese citizen voluntarily entering a foreign war and taking up arms against Soviet forces. Japanese officials reportedly struggled to understand his motivations. One foreign ministry representative described his characteristics as being difficult to understand. Tanaka, however, didn't seem interested in changing his mind. To him, this wasn't simply somebody else's war anymore, and this is where it's important to separate the legend from the documented story. Over the years, Tanaka became known in popular retellings as the Afghan samurai. The nickname is powerful, but it can also make the story sound like an adventure movie. It wasn't. Tanaka suffered from serious illnesses and injuries during his time in Afghanistan, according to later reporting. And in 1989, UPI reported that he had fought alongside Afghan rebels for years and intended to return even as the Soviet withdrawal was taking place. He was also reported to carry an extra grenade, saying he would rather die than be captured. Whether you see Tanaka as a warrior, an idealist, a fanatic, or simply a man who made an extraordinary decision, one thing is undeniable. He voluntarily walked into a war that had nothing obvious to do with his everyday life in Japan. And perhaps the strangest part of Tanaka's story isn't how he got to Afghanistan, it's why he stayed. At first, his motivation appears heavily connected to his opposition to the Soviet Union. But once he spent time among the Afghan resistance, his relationship with the conflict developed further. He wasn't simply observing Afghanistan from the outside. He was training fighters, he was entering combat, he was returning again and again, and eventually he wrote about his experiences and continued supporting Afghanistan after the war. So perhaps the real mystery isn't, why would a Japanese man go to Afghanistan? It's, what happens to someone when they enter a war believing they're fighting for one reason and eventually begin to see the war as their own? His story is difficult to categorize. Adventurer? Ideologue? Or simply a man searching for something he couldn't find at home? Maybe that's what makes his story worth remembering. A Japanese man went looking for a war in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan changed the rest of his life.